She laughed at him in front of a room full of strangers. Claire stood in the marble lobby of the Grand Meridian Manhattan, champagne in hand, diamonds at her throat, and she laughed at the man she once promised to love forever. "Michael Anderson," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Still nobody." He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just smiled the quiet, steady smile of a man who knows exactly what he built while everyone else was looking away. But here's what Claire didn't know yet. She wasn't standing in a hotel. She was standing in his. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if this one hits you, hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss where this goes. The elevator doors opened on the 32nd floor of the Grand Meridian Manhattan at precisely 7:14 on a Tuesday morning, and Michael Anderson stepped out alone. No assistant trailing behind him with a tablet. No bodyguard checking corners. No chief of staff rattling off the morning's agenda into his ear. Just a man in a dark navy suit, well-made but not flashy. The kind of suit you'd walk past at a cocktail party without a second thought, carrying a single leather notebook that had seen better days, its cover worn soft at the corners from years of being opened and closed in places nobody thought to look for him. He paused at the end of the hallway, pulled the notebook open to a fresh page, wrote one word at the top, Tuesday. Then he started walking. He checked the baseboards first. Always the baseboards. 15 years of running other people's hotels had taught him that the baseboards told you everything you needed to know about a property's soul, not the lobby chandeliers, not the thread count cards tucked into the pillow shams, not the frosted glass welcome amenities that the marketing department spent 3 weeks debating. The baseboards. The corners. The parts of a building that guests never consciously noticed, but always felt. He crouched down at the end of the hallway near room 324 Fiend and ran 2 fingers along the trim. Frowned. Wrote something in the notebook. Stood back up. A housekeeper was making her way down the corridor with a cart, and she slowed when she saw him, the way staff always slowed when they spotted someone in a suit they didn't recognize, doing something that didn't fit a tidy category, not a guest, not maintenance, not clearly management either. "Good morning," Michael said. She looked at him carefully. "Good morning, sir. How long have you been with us?" She straightened slightly. 4 years, sir. This property." "What's your name?" "Dolores." "Dolores." He nodded slowly like he was filing it somewhere important. "The baseboards in this corridor, when were they last deep cleaned?" "Do you know?" She blinked. Not the question she expected from a man in a suit. They're on the quarterly rotation. Should have been done 3 weeks ago." "Were they?" A pause. "I don't know, sir. I wasn't the one assigned." He wrote something in the notebook again. Not aggressively, no sharp punishing strokes, just quietly, the way a doctor notes a symptom. "I'm going to have someone look into the rotation schedule. It won't reflect on you. I just need to know where the breakdown happened." Dolores looked at him for a moment. "You're not from corporate, are you?" It wasn't really a question. Michael almost smiled. "What makes you say that? Corporate people don't crouch down and touch the baseboards," she said. "They look at spreadsheets." This time he did smile, full and genuine. "You're not wrong." He clicked the pen closed. "Is there anything you think we should be doing differently on this floor? Anything that bothers you when you're working that nobody asks about?" She stared at him like he'd just said something in a language she vaguely recognized but hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. "You want my opinion? I wouldn't ask if I didn't." She thought about it for a real moment. Not the polished practice answer that employees give when they sense a trap, a real pause, real consideration. "The supply closet at the far end is too small. We have to make 2 trips for every room on this wing, because we can't fit everything in the cart the way the closet's laid out. It costs time. In the afternoon when checkout turnover hits at the same time as new arrivals, those extra trips add up fast." Michael wrote it down. All of it. "How long has that been the case?" "Since I started, 4 years. And nobody fixed it. Nobody asked." He closed the notebook. "Someone will be in touch with you about it this week. We're going to do something about that closet." She watched him walk away, and for a long moment she didn't move, standing in the corridor with her cart, trying to figure out exactly who that man was. Michael had learned a long time ago that the most important thing about running a hotel, about running any operation where human beings moved through space and depended on other human beings to make that experience feel effortless, was that the problems were never where you thought they were. The problems were always where nobody was looking. He'd understood that at 32 when he was managing a mid-tier Marriott property in New Jersey, and the general manager kept telling corporate that guest satisfaction scores were lagging because the competition had a rooftop bar. Michael had looked at the numbers for 6 months and quietly, privately come to a completely different conclusion. The satisfaction scores were lagging because checkout took 14 minutes on average when it should have taken 4, and nobody had ever bothered to retrain the front desk staff on the software system that had been updated 2 years prior. He'd retrained the staff over 2 weekends. Checkout times dropped to 5 minutes. Scores climbed 11 points in 90 days. The general manager took the credit at the quarterly review. Michael had sat in the back of that conference room and said nothing, because he understood even then, at 32, before the marriage and the daughter and the divorce, and the long years of rebuilding that credit, wasn't what he was after. Understanding was what he was after. Understanding why things failed. Understanding what the actual problem was beneath the stated problem. Understanding the invisible machinery of a building full of strangers who came in tired and stressed and guarded and needed, even if they'd never say it out loud, to feel for a few hours or a few days like someone had thought carefully about what they needed. That was what he was after. And eventually, after everything fell apart, that understanding was the only thing he had left to build with. The morning he signed the divorce papers was the morning he understood what the next 8 years would cost him. Not in money. Money was the least of it in the end. He understood what it would cost him in time, in proximity, in the particular irreplaceable currency of being present. He and Claire had sat on opposite sides of a conference table in a midtown law office with their respective attorneys, and she had been dressed beautifully. She was always dressed beautifully. That was never the issue, and across the table she had looked at him with something that wasn't quite contempt, because Claire was too composed for contempt. It was something quieter than contempt, more resigned. Disappointment. The specific disappointment of a woman who had made a calculation and was now acknowledging calmly that the calculation had been wrong from the start. She'd signed her name first. Then she'd looked up and said, and this was so like Claire, so precisely surgically Claire, "I want you to know I don't hate you, Michael. I just need more than this life was ever going to give us." He'd looked at her for a moment. More than what? He asked, because he genuinely wanted to know. He wasn't being combative. He'd never been combative. That he would later understand was part of the problem she had with him. "More than comfortable," she said. "I need someone who wants to build something. Who has..." She paused, searching for the word ambition, real ambition, not just competence. He thought about the Marriott, about the checkout times, about the 11-point swing in 90 days that nobody had attributed to him. He didn't say any of that. He just signed the papers. His attorney had driven him back to the apartment he'd rented in Hoboken. Small 2 bedrooms, one for him and one for Emma when she stayed. And on the ride across the river, he'd sat in the back seat and stared at the Manhattan skyline and thought about what Claire had said. More than comfortable. She wasn't wrong exactly. That was the part that stayed with him longer than any other part. Not the anger, which faded, and not the humiliation, which faded too, but the quiet, persistent thought that she wasn't entirely wrong. He had been comfortable. He had been good at what he did, and he had been comfortable doing it, and he had never asked himself whether being good at something and being comfortable doing it was the same thing as wanting to build something. He asked himself that question on the ride across the river, and the answer surprised him. It wasn't the same thing at all. Emma was 4 years old when the divorce was finalized. She was the reason he got out of bed the next morning and the morning after that, and the morning after that for 8 years running. Not metaphorically. Literally. She was the reason he set the alarm, the reason he made coffee, The reason he put on his shoes and walked out the door and did the next thing that needed doing, even when the next thing was small and the horizon seemed impossibly distant, and the apartment felt like a place someone had left in a hurry and never quite returned to. I had her on alternating weeks and every other weekend per the custody agreement, and on the weeks he didn't have her, the apartment was so quiet that he sometimes worked until 2 in the morning, just to have noise in the room, the tap of the keyboard, the scratch of the pen, because the silence in a place where a 4-year-old isn't anymore is a particular kind of silence that people who haven't felt it don't know how to describe. He described it to himself privately as the sound of the future demanding something of you. On the weeks he had her, everything was different. She was a serious child, not somber. She laughed easily. She asked endless questions. She was fascinated by trains and dogs and the specific way that light moved through glass, but serious in the sense that she engaged with the world as though it mattered, as though the questions she asked deserved real answers and would be disappointed by anything less. "Daddy," she asked him one evening when she was 6, sitting at the small kitchen table in Hoboken with a bowl of pasta and the focused expression she wore when something had been working itself out in her mind all day. "Why do you look at hotels so much?" He'd been reading something on his laptop. He looked up. "What do you mean?" "When we walk past them, you always look at them, like you're thinking about something." He considered how to answer this honestly. With Emma, you answered honestly, or you didn't answer at all. She'd inherited some quality from him or from herself. Hard to say, that made her register dishonesty like a change in atmospheric pressure. Not call it out necessarily, just register it and store it. "I look at them because I'm trying to understand why some of them work and some of them don't," he said. "What do you mean work?" "I mean why some of them feel good to walk into, like someone thought about you before you got there, and why some of them feel like nobody thought about anything except collecting the money." Emma chewed her pasta and considered this. "How can you tell from outside? You can't always. But sometimes you can see little things, the way the entrance is lit, whether the door is easy to open, whether there's a place to sit down near the lobby if you're tired." He paused. "The details tell you whether someone cares." She nodded slowly. "Is that what you want to do? Make hotels that care?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "I think that's exactly what I want to do." She went back to her pasta. "Okay," she said as though it was settled, and something in that moment was. The first property he bought was a 40-room hotel in Trenton, New Jersey, that had been losing money for 6 consecutive years and smelled on the day he walked through it like a compromise that had given up on itself. The owner was a 71-year-old man named Gerald, who had inherited the property from his father and had spent the better part of 3 decades not quite knowing what to do with it. He'd tried new carpeting in 2009. He'd tried a continental breakfast in 2014. He'd tried loyalty discount cards in 2017. None of it had moved the needle, and now he sat across from Michael in a tired office behind the front desk, looking at a man who was offering to buy a building that nobody else had come back to twice. "You understand what you're looking at," Gerald said. It was not a question. "I think so," Michael said. 3 major infrastructure issues. Staff turnover that hasn't dropped below 40% in 4 years. A TripAdvisor rating that I'd rather not say out loud. 2.3, Michael said. Gerald winced. "You looked it up." "I look at everything." "Then you know what you're getting into." Gerald leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over the desk. "So why do you want it?" Michael looked at him steadily. "Because the problems here are fixable. The bones of this building are solid. The infrastructure issues are real, but they're not structural, they're operational. The TripAdvisor rating isn't about the building, it's about the system that runs inside it, and systems can be changed." Gerald studied him for a long moment. "You sound like you believe that." "I do. Most people who've come through that door in the past 2 years have wanted to tear it down and build condos." "I'm not most people." Another long pause. Gerald looked at the man across from him, this 40-year-old in a good but not flashy suit, with a battered leather notebook, and the steady, unhurried manner of someone who had already accounted for the possibility of things going wrong and made peace with it, and something in the old man's face shifted. "Why should I sell it to you instead of the condo developers?" Gerald asked. Not aggressively, genuinely. "Because the condo developers will tear down something your father built and put 40 luxury units where 40 travelers used to have somewhere decent to sleep." Michael paused. "And because I'll pay you fair value in cash within 30 days. Gerald looked at the desk for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "My father opened this hotel in 1959. He shook hands with everyone who came through the front door for the first 20 years. "I know," Michael said. "I read the local history." Gerald looked up. "You read the local history?" "The Trenton Historical Society has an archive. Your father's quoted in the 1967 municipal report. He said a hotel's job is to make strangers feel expected." The old man was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Make me an offer." Michael made the offer. It was accepted. He spent the next 14 months inside that building, learning every system, every flaw, every friction point where the experience of a guest collided with the reality of what the hotel was actually capable of delivering, and then one by one, he fixed them. Not with money he didn't have. The bank had laughed at his first loan application, a memory that he kept in a specific, useful corner of his mind, but with knowledge, and with the kind of patient, methodical attention that he'd spent 15 years developing in properties that belonged to other people. He rehired 3 former employees who'd left in frustration and asked them directly what had driven them out. They told him. He fixed it. The TripAdvisor rating climbed from 2.3 to 3.8 in 8 months. By the 14th month, it was 4.4. By month 18, the Trenton property was operating at 73% occupancy and running a profit for the first time in 11 years. He bought the second property with the proceeds. Then the third. I didn't tell anyone what he was building. Not because he was secretive by nature, he wasn't, but because there was nothing to tell yet. There was only the work and the next property and the notebook with the worn cover that collected observations about baseboards and supply closets and checkout times and the specific quality of a lobby that made a tired traveler feel expected instead of processed. He told Emma on a Sunday evening when she was 8 and sitting on the floor of his office in the second apartment, larger now in Jersey City, with a proper desk and a proper bookshelf, while he went over the numbers for property number 4. "Em," he said, "I want to show you something." She looked up from her book. He turned the laptop so she could see the spreadsheet. "See these numbers? This one's the first hotel I bought. This one's the second. This one's the third." She studied the screen seriously. "They're all going up." "They are. Is that good? It means they're making money, which means I can buy another one and try to make that one better too." She looked at the numbers a moment longer, then looked at him. "Daddy, are you building something?" He looked at his daughter. He thought about the question. He thought about the kitchen table in Hoboken, and the pasta, and the answer he'd given a 2-year-old girl about hotels that care. "Yeah, Em," he said. "I think I am." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her book. By the time Michael Anderson was 42 years old, Anderson Hospitality Group owned 23 properties across 8 states, employed over 4,000 people, and was valued conservatively by the analysts who covered the hospitality sector and had somehow only recently noticed the company existing at somewhere north of $2 billion. He did not have a publicist. He did not have a social media account. He gave in 8 years exactly 1 interview to a trade publication for hotel operations professionals that had a circulation of about 12,000, in which he said, among other things, that the single most important metric in the hospitality industry was the number of problems that guests solved for themselves because the hotel had anticipated what they needed before they knew they needed it. The interviewer had asked him how he measured that. He'd said, "You walk the building and you look at the faces." Beyond that, he was essentially invisible. He liked it that way. Not because he was ashamed of what he'd built, and not because he was afraid of scrutiny, but because the things that mattered most to him. Emma, the work, the specific satisfaction of walking into a building that had been broken and watching it become something that functioned with integrity. None of those things required an audience. Claire had wanted an audience. He'd understood that about her even during the marriage, that her sense of a life well lived was inseparable from the sense of that life being observed and validated and confirmed. He didn't judge her for it. It was simply how she was constituted, the same way he was constituted to need the opposite. What he hadn't understood until long after the divorce was that his quietness had read to her as smallness. His lack of performance had read as lack of ambition. His patience had read as passivity. And by the time she'd left, she had genuinely not maliciously concluded that there was nothing inside him that was going to grow. She had been looking at the wrong thing. That was all. She had been measuring what she could see, and what she could see a manager at a mid-tier hotel chain bringing home a salary that was decent but not remarkable, in a life that was stable but not spectacular, had not given her reason to look for anything else. He didn't blame her. He blamed himself a little for never finding a way to show her the part she wasn't seeing, the part that spent 15 years filing observations in a notebook, that crouched down and touched baseboards, that stayed in the back of the conference room and said nothing, while the general manager took the credit and noted privately that the 11-point swing had happened because he'd asked a question nobody else had thought to ask. He'd never learned to make that part visible. He'd only learned to make it useful. Howe was on the 32nd floor of the Grand Meridian Manhattan, his flagship property and the crown of everything he'd built, making a note in the battered leather notebook about the supply closet at the east end of the corridor, when his phone buzzed with a message from his general manager. Mr. Anderson, per the event calendar, the Whitmore Group Gala is tonight. Full buyout of the ballroom and the 4th floor event suite. VIP guests arriving from 6 p.m. Wanted to flag in case you're still in the building. He looked at this message, the Whitmore Group. I knew the name. It appeared in financial news occasionally, a mid-sized private equity firm with interests in commercial real estate. Nothing that overlapped with his sector. The name of the principal partner he'd seen somewhere. He tucked the phone back into his pocket without replying. He had 3 more floors to walk. I went back to the notebook and wrote, East Corridor Supply Closet. Expand footprint or reconfigure shelving system. Consult with Dolores re-workflow specifics before making changes. He underlined Dolores. Then he kept walking, in the lobby. Below him, a black car was pulling up to the entrance of the Grand Meridian Manhattan, and a woman was stepping out. Beautiful, composed, dressed with the specific, deliberate elegance of someone who understood that an entrance was never accidental, and she paused for a moment on the steps, looking up at the facade of the building, with the satisfied expression of someone arriving somewhere they believed themselves worthy of. Her name was Claire Whitmore, formerly Claire Anderson, and she had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. Claire Whitmore had a system for entering rooms. She had developed it over years, not consciously, not from a book or a coaching session, but the way most survival skills develop gradually under pressure, shaped by the accumulated weight of a life spent in rooms where the wrong entrance could cost you something you couldn't get back. She walked in slowly enough to be seen, but not so slowly that it looked deliberate. She made eye contact with the person of highest status. First, always first, before anyone else. Before the room had fully registered her, and she held that contact just long enough to signal that she knew exactly where the power was sitting and that she intended to be near it. Daniel had taught her some of it, but most of it she'd figured out herself. She stepped into the lobby of the Grand Meridian Manhattan at 6:03, and for one brief, unguarded moment, she forgot the system entirely. Because the lobby was extraordinary. Not in the way that expensive lobbies were usually extraordinary. The kind of extraordinary that announced itself loudly through square footage and chandelier wattage and the specific hush that a lot of money buys when it wants to tell you it exists. This was something quieter. The lighting was warm and precisely angled so that everyone who walked through the entrance looked somehow like the best version of themselves. The furniture was placed in arrangements that managed the rare trick of feeling both spacious and intimate simultaneously. There were fresh flowers, but not the aggressive performative arrangements that 5-star hotels typically used to signal luxury. Smaller, more considered, the kind that suggested someone had thought about the specific person who would sit near them and wanted that person to feel welcomed rather than impressed. It felt, Claire thought before she could stop herself, like someone had thought carefully about what she needed before she arrived. She caught herself having that thought, and something shifted uncomfortably in her chest. She pushed it aside. Daniel was already inside, standing near the reception desk, with the particular posture he adopted when he was doing business in a space that wasn't his. Shoulders slightly forward. Chin lifted, the body language of a man who needed people to know he was important before he'd established it through any other means. He was talking to a woman at the front desk with the kind of aggressive pleasantness that was barely distinguishable from a threat. "The suite reservation," he was saying as Claire approached. "The Whitmore Group. We have a full event buyout tonight, the ballroom and the fourth-floor suite. I need to confirm that the modifications we requested last week have been accommodated." The woman at the desk, mid-30s, composed with the very particular brand of patience that exceptional hotel staff develop from spending years absorbing the anxieties of strangers, typed. Something looked at the screen and said, "Mr. Whitmore, welcome to the Grand Meridian. Your ballroom reservation is confirmed. I do see a note here regarding the suite modifications." "Good," Daniel said. "We were not able to accommodate all of them." The pleasantness evaporated. "I'm sorry. The request to remove the interior wall between suites 401 and 402 to create a single event space, that's a structural modification that requires a permit and a 60-day lead time. We communicated that to your assistant last week." Daniel looked at the woman as though she had said something in a language he didn't speak. "I'm hosting 45 people tonight. I need that space. We've reserved the adjacent meeting room on the 4th floor at no additional charge. It's actually a larger space than what the combined suites would have provided. Our events team has already set it up according to the specifications your assistant emailed us." "That's not what I asked for." "I understand," the woman said in a tone that acknowledged the feeling without conceding the argument. "And I'm sorry we weren't able to provide exactly what you requested. But the meeting room is an excellent space, and our team has taken care to make sure it suits your event." Daniel leaned slightly forward. "Who authorized this decision?" "Standard policy, sir. Structural modifications require." "I know what you said about the permit. I'm asking who made the call to deny my specific request." The woman at the desk held his gaze without wavering. "That would be our operations team, sir, working within standard property policy." Claire put a hand on Daniel's arm. "It's fine," she said. "Let's just go up and look at it." He turned to her with the expression he wore when he felt his authority being managed. She'd gotten very good at recognizing that expression in the 2 years since they'd married. It was the expression that meant the next 30 minutes were going to require careful handling. "It's not fine," he said quietly enough that only she could hear it. "I told Whitmore Group Associates the suite would be configured specifically for a private dinner. I told them that specifically. Then we'll make it work with what we have." She squeezed his arm once with the precise pressure that meant not here, not in front of the staff. "Come on. We need to go up and see the room before the guests arrive." He straightened. The pleasant aggression reassembled itself on his face. He looked at the woman at the desk one more time, not a long look, just enough to deposit the clear, unmistakable message that this conversation was not over, and then he turned and walked toward the elevator with Claire beside him. She glanced back at the front desk as they left. The woman behind it was already helping the next guest, her expression exactly as composed as it had been before Daniel had tried to make it otherwise. Claire thought briefly, and without being able to help it, good for her. Then she got into the elevator with her husband and prepared for the next 45 minutes. The elevator climbed. Daniel was quiet, which was almost worse than if he'd been talking. His silence was never restful. It was the silence of a man running calculations. 42 people tonight, he said, half to her and half to the middle distance. Hendricks is coming. Morse. The 2 Baxter brothers. He exhaled slowly. I can't have Hendricks walking into a room that looks like a conference call setup. It won't, Claire said. You heard her. The events team set it up to the specifications we sent. It'll be fine. You keep saying that. Because you keep saying it won't be. He looked at her. Is this a bad time to remind me that this deal closes at midnight, or it doesn't close at all? It was not a bad time. It was a terrible time. I'm aware, Daniel. The elevator reached the 4th floor. The doors opened. The meeting room was, it had to be admitted, it just had to be beautiful. The events team had transformed it with the kind of sleight of hand that top-tier hotel staff deployed, when they needed to turn a corporate space into something that felt personal. Lighting warm and indirect, long table dressed with linen and low centerpieces that didn't block sight lines, chairs arranged with enough space between them that 42 people would feel comfortable rather than compressed. Small details everywhere, a handwritten menu card at each place setting a subtle fragrance that softened the air without announcing itself. Daniel walked in and stood at the head of the table and looked at the room. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "See?" Claire said. "It's not what I asked for," he said. But something in his posture had settled. Slightly. Reluctantly. "No," she agreed. "But it's good." He pulled out his phone and started making calls. She walked to the window and looked out at the city going dark below her, and tried without much success to unknot the tension that had been sitting between her shoulder blades since they'd walked in. She was good at this. She was good at managing Daniel's edges, at smoothing the surfaces of situations that he sharpened with his anxiety and his need for control. She'd developed that skill gradually, the way she'd developed the system for entering rooms, because it had become necessary. She was very, very good at things that had become necessary. The guests started arriving at 6:45. She worked the room, the way she always worked rooms, moving between people with the specific grace of someone who had learned that her greatest professional asset was her ability to make each individual feel for the duration of a conversation like the most interesting person in any given space. She remembered names. She remembered the small specific details that people dropped in passing a daughter's gymnastics competition, a recent trip, a book someone had mentioned wanting to read, and she returned those details to people later in a way that made them feel genuinely seen. She was good at it. She was good at it the way Michael was good at walking baseboards, not because anyone had asked her to be, and not because she'd planned it, but because she'd looked around at the environment she was in and understood instinctively what it required. The thought of Michael arrived without warning, the way it occasionally did in rooms like this, and she handled it the same way she always handled it. Noted it, set it aside, moved on. By 7:30, the room was full, and Daniel had relaxed into the version of himself that was actually charming. Not the anxious, aggressive man at the reception desk, but the sharp, funny, genuinely knowledgeable dealmaker who had built a company worth paying attention to. She watched him work the Baxter brothers and felt the familiar, complicated mix of admiration and something she didn't examine too closely. He was good at his version of this. She was good at hers. Together they were formidable. She had told herself that enough times over 2 years that she almost always believed it. At 8:15, she slipped out of the room to make a phone call, her sister who had Olivia for the night confirming pickup time in the morning, and she stood in the quiet corridor outside the event suite with her phone to her ear and her back to the wall and let herself breathe for a moment without managing anything. Her sister picked up on the third ring. "How's the event?" "Fine. Good. Tell me Olivia ate something green." "She ate broccoli under protest." "That counts." "She asked if you'd be home before bed." Claire closed her eyes for half a second. "Tell her I'll be there to wake her up in the morning. Tell her I'll make the eggs. The scrambled ones with the cheese. The scrambled ones with the cheese." "Okay." A pause. "You sound tired, Claire." "I'm at an event." "You sound tired and you're at an event. That's the specific tired." She almost said, "I'm fine, had it." The words already queued up in the reliable, efficient way that certain words got queued up after you'd said them often enough. But something didn't let her say it. Instead, she said, "I'm okay, Jen." Which wasn't the same thing. Her sister heard the difference. She always did. "Call me tomorrow," she said. "After the eggs." After the eggs. She hung up and stood in the corridor for another moment, looking at nothing in particular. And then she straightened, pulled her composure back into place, like a coat she'd set briefly on a chair, and she went back inside to help close the deal. The deal closed at 11:40. Not midnight. 11:40. 20 minutes early, which Daniel would tell people for the next several weeks, as evidence of something though, Claire was never quite sure what. In the elevator on the way down. Daniel was ebullient, the particular buoyancy of a man who has been worried about something for weeks and has now had the anxiety resolved. He was talking about the Hendricks family's history in commercial real estate. Something about the grandfather who'd built half of downtown Pittsburgh, and Claire was listening with the appropriate percentage of her attention, while the other percentage sat quietly apart and wondered what she was going to do about the feeling that had been sitting in her chest since she'd walked into the lobby 3 hours ago. The feeling that someone had thought carefully about what she needed before she arrived. The feeling that she hadn't had that thought about a place in a very long time. The elevator opened on the lobby level, and they stepped out into the warm light, and Daniel was saying something about a car, and Claire looked up and across the lobby toward the front desk and stopped walking, because there was a man standing near the concierge station with a worn leather notebook in his hand, talking to a staff member in the calm, specific way of someone who belonged in the room, not as a guest and not exactly as management either, but as something else, as the center of gravity around which the whole room quietly organized itself without making it obvious. He was wearing a dark navy suit. He was 42 years old, and his name was Michael Anderson. She stood completely still. For 3 full seconds, she counted them. Absurdly, felt each one pass, she did not breathe. He hadn't seen her. He was looking at the notebook, then at the staff member listening to something the young man was saying with the kind of attention that made people feel that what they were saying was worth saying. He nodded once, wrote something down, said something back. The staff member nodded with the specific quality of a nod that came not from deference, but from being heard. Claire watched this. She watched this, and something turned over slowly in her chest. Then Daniel put his hand on her lower back and said, "Car's out front, you okay?" And the moment broke. "Fine," she said, automatically. "I thought I recognized someone." Daniel looked in the direction she was looking. Michael was walking now, moving toward a corridor that led off the lobby's eastern side, still writing in the notebook without looking up, completely unhurried. "Who?" "Nobody," Claire said. "Nobody. Let's go." They went. In the car crossing 57th Street toward the park. Daniel talked about the deal. He talked about Hendricks and the Baxter brothers, and what this meant for the Q2 numbers, and what he wanted to do with the capital position. He talked with the energy of a man who had won something and wanted to keep winning it for as long as the night would let him. Claire sat beside him and watched the city go past, and thought about a man with a worn leather notebook who moved through a room the way the room had been built around him. She said nothing, but she thought very quietly in the part of herself she didn't usually let have the floor. He looked good. Not just physically, though, that was true. He had aged the way some men aged when their life had given them something worth carrying steadier somehow. More present. What she couldn't shake was the other thing. The smaller, more specific thing. The staff member he'd been talking to. The young man had looked at Michael Anderson with an expression Claire recognized from 20 years of reading rooms and reading people. It was an expression she had seen on the faces of people talking to Daniel when the deal was going well, and on the faces of people talking to the various powerful men she'd navigated in the years since the divorce. It was the expression of someone who genuinely respected the person in front of them. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. She had worked in rooms full of powerful men her entire adult life, and she knew the difference between those two things better than almost anyone. The car turned north, and the park swept past on her right, dark and vast and patient, and Claire Whitmore sat very still in the back seat and did the thing she almost never did. She let herself wonder, not about Michael exactly, about herself, about the calculation she had made at 34 years old across a conference table in a midtown law office, and whether the variables she had put into that calculation were the ones that actually mattered, and whether the number she had come out with was the right number, and whether this was the part she pulled back from, always because it cost too much to stay there, whether the life she'd built on that calculation was the life she'd actually wanted, or only the life she'd decided she deserved. The car stopped in front of their building on Central Park West. The doorman opened her door. She got out. She went inside. She did not sleep well that night. 3 days later, she came back. She told Daniel she had a lunch meeting with a potential investor, which was true as far as it went. What she didn't tell him was that the investor's preferred meeting spot was the restaurant on the second floor of the Grand Meridian, Manhattan, and that she had chosen this particular investor partly because of that fact. She told herself it was a coincidence. She was good at telling herself things. The restaurant was full at 12:15 on a Friday, and the lunch was real 45 minutes with a woman named Patricia Holt, who ran a small impact fund and was considering a real estate allocation, and Claire was, as she was always, was excellent at the meeting itself. Focused, informed, responsive. She had done her homework on Patricia's fund on the portfolio companies on the specific intersection of commercial real estate and social impact investing that Patricia cared about. It was a good meeting. Patricia said she'd be in touch. They shook hands near the restaurant's entrance, and Claire watched Patricia move toward the elevator, and then she was alone in the lobby again. She stood for a moment with her bag on her shoulder. She told herself she was going to get a car and go back to the office. Instead, she walked to the concierge desk. The man behind it was young, early 30s, with the kind of alert, warm efficiency that suggested he was good at his job and knew it without being smug about it. He looked up as she approached. "Good afternoon. Can I help you with something?" "I was here earlier this week," Claire said. "For an event, the Whitmore Group dinner." "Of course. I hope the evening went well." "It did. I wanted to." She paused, and then said the thing that was technically true, without being the whole truth. "I wanted to pass along a compliment about the events team, the way they handled some last-minute modifications. It was genuinely impressive." The concierge smiled. "That's very kind. I'll make sure it gets to the right people." "Who would I pass it to directly? I'd like it to go to the right person. Our director of events handles the team. Her name is Sandra Reeves. I can connect you." "What about the owner?" Claire said. She hadn't planned to say it. It arrived fully formed the way things occasionally arrived when she stopped managing herself closely enough. The concierge's expression shifted very slightly, very professionally. "I'm sorry. The property. I'd heard through a contact that it's privately held, not a chain." She kept her voice even mildly curious, the tone of someone making polite conversation. "I was just wondering who was responsible for the culture here, because it shows, in the staff, in the way the building runs." The concierge looked at her for a moment. "Our operations are overseen at the group level," he said carefully. "If you'd like to pass along a written compliment to leadership, I can certainly." "Anderson Hospitality Group," Claire said. It came out quieter than she intended. The concierge looked at her. "That's correct." She nodded, said nothing else for a moment. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" he asked. "No," she said. "Thank you." She walked toward the lobby exit. Her heels were quiet on the marble floor. Anderson Hospitality Group. She had looked it up the night after the gala alone in the bathroom at 2 in the morning while Daniel slept on her phone with the brightness turned down. She had typed the name of the hotel into a search engine and gone down the chain of ownership until she found the group name, and then she had typed the group name and she had sat on the edge of the bathtub in the dark and read the search results. There weren't many. No press releases. No founder profiles in business magazines. No feature stories about the entrepreneurial journey. Just the basic corporate filings, a trade publication piece from several years back, and a hospitality industry directory listing that described Anderson Hospitality Group as a privately held company specializing in the acquisition and operational rehabilitation of underperforming hotel properties. 23 properties. 8 states. Valuation not publicly disclosed. She had sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time. She had thought about a man across a conference table who had said in a voice that was completely without bitterness, "I want you to know I don't hate you, Michael. I just need more than this life was ever going to give us." She had thought about what she had said. "I need someone who wants to build something." She walked through the lobby doors and into the afternoon, and the city received her, and she kept walking, and she did not let herself finish the thought. But she knew walking fast now toward nothing, toward the next thing that the thought would find her eventually. It always did. She turned south on Madison Avenue and took her phone out and called Daniel's assistant to confirm the 3 o'clock. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. 2 blocks north of where she was walking back inside the lobby of the Grand Meridian Manhattan, Michael Anderson had just come off the elevator. He was heading toward the front desk to check in with the evening manager, notebook in hand, unhurried. He had been on site for the past 6 hours, doing what he did every time he visited a property, walking it. Learning it. looking at the things nobody else was looking at. He didn't know Claire had been here. I didn't know she'd asked about him at the concierge desk. He didn't know she'd sat on the edge of a bathtub 2 nights ago in the dark, reading about everything he'd built while everyone else was asleep. He just walked to the front desk, asked how the evening shift was starting, listened to the answer, and wrote something in the notebook. Then he went back to work. He was very good at that. He had always been very good at that. 2 weeks passed. Michael didn't think about Claire. That wasn't entirely accurate. He thought about her, the way you think about a scar that's been there long enough that you've stopped noticing it, except when something presses against it unexpectedly. She existed in his memory, the way certain old decisions existed, not as wounds anymore, not as regrets exactly, but as reference points. Fixed coordinates in the map of how he'd become who he was. He had bigger things pressing on him in those 2 weeks. The Portland acquisition was stalling. The seller's attorney had come back with a counteroffer that restructured 3 key clauses in ways that Michael's general counsel described as aggressive but not insane, which in legal terms meant it was going to cost him another 2 weeks of negotiation and probably $40,000 in attorney's fees. The property in Denver was 6 weeks behind on a renovation timeline because the contractor had underestimated the plumbing retrofit, which meant the reopening event he'd promised to the Denver business community was going to have to be rescheduled, which meant a conversation he was not looking forward to having. And Emma, who was 10 years old, and therefore old enough to have opinions about everything, and young enough to express them without any filter whatsoever, had decided that she wanted to spend spring break with her mother instead of on the trip he'd been planning to take her to Charleston. That last one was the one that actually kept him up at night. Not because he blamed Emma. He didn't. She was 10. Her world was shifting in the specific seismic way that 10-year-old worlds shifted friendships, becoming complicated. School, becoming more serious. The first stirrings of a self that was distinctly her own and not just the child-shaped extension of her parents. Of course she wanted to spend a week with her mother. Of course she did. He'd called Claire to arrange it on a Tuesday morning, standing in his home office in the apartment in Jersey City, with a cup of coffee going cold on the desk beside him. She'd picked up on the second ring. Michael. Hey. He kept his voice easy. This was something he'd practiced for 8 years, keeping his voice easy when he talked to Claire about Emma, because Emma could feel tension in the arrangements, even when she wasn't in the room for the conversation, the way children felt tension in everything. Emma mentioned she'd like to spend spring break with you. I wanted to check before I said anything definitive to her. A brief pause on Claire's end. She called me about it last night. I know. She mentioned that too. He almost smiled. She's thorough. She is. Another pause. Is that okay? I know you had plans. It's fine. Charleston will keep. She wants to be with you. That's a good thing. Claire was quiet for a moment, in a way that felt different from her usual pauses, which were generally tactical. This felt more like she was sitting with something. Thank you, Michael, for being good about it. She's my daughter. Being good about it isn't optional. Most people make it optional, Claire said. You never have. He didn't know what to do with that, so he moved on. They confirmed the dates, the pickup arrangement, the logistics. They were very good at logistics now. 8 years of parallel parenting had made them fluent in a language that was entirely practical and entirely functional and contained almost nothing personal. When they hung up, Michael stood at his desk and looked at the cold coffee and thought about the quality of that pause on her end of the line. He filed it in the same place he filed the observations about baseboards. Not because he was going to do anything with it. Just because he noticed things, and noticing things was what he did. Spring break came and went. Emma came back from her mother's with a new haircut, subtle, just a trim, but she was 10 and thrilled about it in the particular way of a girl becoming aware of herself, and a new book that Claire had apparently recommended, and a story about a restaurant they'd gone to in Brooklyn that had made Emma laugh so hard she'd snorted her water. Michael sat at the kitchen table while Emma told him the story, and he laughed too genuinely, because the image of his daughter snorting water was genuinely funny, and because Claire taking Emma to a restaurant that made his daughter laugh was exactly what he wanted for Emma, regardless of what it made him feel about anything else. Did you have a good time? he asked. Really good, Emma said. Then she looked at him with the directness that was entirely her own. Dad, are you and Mom ever going to be friends again? He looked at her. We're not unfriends. You know what I mean. He did know what she meant. We're good, he said. We're different kinds of good than we used to be, but we're good. She considered this with the earnestness she brought to most things. I think Mom's different lately. Different how? Quieter. Emma looked at her book. Like she's thinking about something. Michael said nothing, but he filed that too. The morning. Everything changed. Started the way most consequential mornings started ordinarily. Michael was at the Grand Meridian by 7:45, notebook in hand, working through the lobby-level staff with his operations manager, a sharp 38-year-old named Ray, who had been with Anderson Hospitality for 4 years, and was the kind of man who asked the right questions without being asked to ask them. They were standing near the concierge station, going through the occupancy projections for the following week, when Ray said without particular emphasis, "There's a thing tonight. Big one. The Lancaster dinner." Michael didn't look up from the notebook. I saw it on the calendar. The Lancaster Group are bringing 28 people. Private event, full buyout of the mezzanine. Lancaster himself RSVP'd yesterday. Good. His guest list includes the Whitmore Group principals. Ray paused. Daniel Whitmore and his wife. Michael was still looking at the notebook. He wrote something. Then he looked up. That's fine. Ray looked at him. You sure? Why wouldn't I be? I know who she is, Michael. They had worked together for 4 years. Ray was one of exactly 3 people on Earth who knew the complete version of Michael's story. Not the professional version, not the trade publication version, but the real one, including the divorce and the Hoboken apartment, and the cold coffee, and the specific particular cost of building something from nothing while raising a daughter alone. Michael closed the notebook. She's a guest of one of our clients. She'll be treated like any other guest. I'm just asking if you want to. I'll be here tonight, Michael said. I'm always here for major events. That won't change. He looked at Ray steadily. Is there a problem? Ray held up one hand. No problem. Good. What's the linen situation on the mezzanine? Ray told him. They moved on. But Ray watched Michael for the rest of the morning with the careful, unobtrusive attention of a man who has known someone long enough to see the things they're not showing. By 6 o'clock that evening, the Grand Meridian's mezzanine level had been transformed for the Lancaster dinner. The Lancaster Group was a legacy commercial real estate firm, 3rd-generation old money. The kind of company that had been having dinners like this one for 50 years and had very specific ideas about how they should feel. They were the kind of clients that the industry called demanding, and Michael called people who know exactly what they want, and he had worked with enough of them to know that the secret to their satisfaction was not excess, but precision. They didn't want more. They wanted exactly right. His events team had gotten it exactly right. Michael had checked the room twice that afternoon, noting the placement of every detail with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything, and both times he'd come out satisfied. Ray had done his job. The team had done theirs. Howe was standing near the second-floor landing at 6:22 when the first guests arrived, and he watched the room fill with the measured professional attention of someone monitoring a system he was responsible for, without wanting to be the most visible part of it. He saw Claire at 6:34. I didn't know how he could be so precise about the time. And then he remembered he had looked at his watch exactly 1 moment before she walked through the mezzanine entrance for no particular reason, the way you sometimes looked at a clock a minute before something happened, and then later the time was fixed in your memory because of what came after it. 6:34. She came in with Daniel, who was working the room before he'd even crossed the threshold. Handshakes, names, the forward-leaning energy of a man who treated every social encounter as a transaction to be optimized. She came in slightly bum, the way she'd always moved into rooms with powerful men, and then she stopped moving. The way you stopped moving when your attention snagged on something you hadn't expected. She saw him. He was 30 feet away. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was Claire who moved first. She said something to Daniel. Michael was too far away to hear it, But he could read the body language, a brief touch on Daniel's arm, an indicator that she was stepping away, and then she crossed the room toward him. He watched her come, and he felt with a clarity that surprised him that he was completely calm. Not the forced calm of suppression. Not the managed calm of a man holding something carefully to keep it from spilling. Just actual calm. The kind that came from being without performance exactly who you were. She stopped 2 feet from him. "Michael," she said. "Claire." She looked at him for a moment without saying anything, and he let her. She was trying to read him, he knew, trying to find the emotional weather, the subtext, the thing beneath the thing. She'd always been good at reading people. What she'd never quite understood was that with him there was rarely something beneath the thing. What he showed was what was there. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight," she said. "It's my hotel," he said, simply. She looked at him for another moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved not quite a smile. "I know that now." "How long have you known?" "Since the gala," she said. "The night with the Whitmore dinner." She paused. "I asked at the concierge desk." He filed that away. And I went home and looked it up." She met his eyes. 23 properties, Michael." 24, he said. "Portland closed last week." Something moved across her face. Not the thing he might have expected. "Know that now." "How long have you known?" "Since the gala," she said. "The night with the Whitmore dinner." She paused. "I asked at the concierge desk." He filed that away. And I went home and looked it up." She met his eyes. 23 properties, Michael." 24, he said. "Portland closed last week." Something moved across her face. Not the thing he might have expected, not embarrassment or even guilt exactly. Something more complicated than either of those. "I didn't," she started, and then stopped. "I owe you an apology." "You don't," he said. "I called you nobody." "You called me still nobody," he said. "There's a distinction." She flinched, slightly. "Real." "That was cruel." "It was honest," he said. "You thought it. Saying it out loud is just honesty." "Michael." "I'm not angry, Claire." And the thing was, he meant it. He looked at her and found only the absence of anger. Not because he'd worked to clear it away, but because it had simply at some point in the past 8 years ceased to be something he carried. "I was never angry. Not really. I was hurt, and then I was tired, and then I was working, and somewhere in the working, the rest of it stopped mattering." She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room moved, conversation, laughter, the particular music of an expensive dinner coming to life, and the two of them stood slightly apart from it, like two people who had stepped briefly outside of time. "That's what I owe you an apology for," she said quietly. "Not just what I said at the gala. For," she paused, and he could see her choosing her words with an unusual carefulness. The way she chose words when she meant them, rather than when she was managing something, for thinking you were small when you were just quiet. He looked at her. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Emma said you seemed different lately." Claire's eyes shifted. "You talked to Emma about me. She brought it up herself. You know how she is." He paused. "She said you were quieter, like you were thinking about something." A long silence. "She's perceptive," Claire said. "She gets it from somewhere." That landed the way he'd intended it to, gently, not as a jab. She looked at him, and the complicated thing on her face shifted again into something almost grateful. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Were you happy back then, in the marriage?" She said it like she'd been carrying the question for a while and needed to put it down. "Because I've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. And I need to know if you were actually unhappy, and I just didn't see it, or if what I did created the unhappiness." He thought about it seriously. Because it was a serious question, and she was asking it seriously, and she deserved an answer that was actually true. "I was content," he finally said. "There's a difference between content and happy, and I had the first one. I think I was waiting for something without knowing I was waiting for it. Something to make the content into something bigger." "And the divorce." "The divorce was the thing that made me stop waiting," he said. "You leaving didn't break me, Claire. It cleared the path." She absorbed that. "Daniel thinks I should invest in the hospitality sector," she said. And there was something almost wry in it, an acknowledgement of the absurdity. "He's been talking to analysts. He didn't know that Anderson Hospitality was the property we were in. That you were—" She stopped. "That I was what?" Michael said. "That you were the one who built it." He looked at her steadily. "Does it change anything for him?" She started to say something, and then stopped and started again. "It will when he finds out." "When?" A pause. "Tonight," she said. "He's going to find out tonight." Michael felt the calm hold steady and complete, like a well-built floor. "How?" "Philip Lancaster," she said. "He knows you. He's going to introduce you. He told me 20 minutes ago that he wanted to introduce the man who built this place before dinner." She looked at Michael steadily. "He doesn't know the history. He just knows you built something remarkable, and he wants to put you in the room." Michael said nothing. "Daniel is going to lose his mind," Claire said, and there was no relish in it, just the flat certainty of a woman who knew her husband's reactions. "That's not my concern," Michael said. "I know it isn't." She looked at him for a long moment. "I just wanted you to know it was coming. So you weren't—" She searched for the word blindsided. He almost smiled. "I don't get blindsided easily." "No," she said. "You never did. I used to mistake that for not caring." He looked at her, and for just a moment, something real passed between them. Not the old thing, not the marriage, not the particular grief of what that had been and what it had cost both of them. Something cleaner than that. An acknowledgement between two people who had known each other at the root, and who were standing here now in the wreckage of that knowing, trying to see each other clearly. "You should go back," he said. "Your husband is going to wonder." She didn't move immediately. "Michael, how are you actually?" "Good," he said, and meant it. "Really good, Claire." She studied him for one more moment. Then she nodded, and something settled in her face. Not resolution exactly, not peace, but something one step closer to both. "I'm glad," she said. "I mean that." She turned and walked back across the room. He watched her go. Then he turned, took out the notebook, and found the page he'd been on before she'd walked through the door. He wrote "Follow up with Lancaster event team, re-post-dinner feedback survey timing." He underlined it. Then Philip Lancaster arrived. Philip Lancaster was 67 years old and had the energy of a man 20 years younger who had never wasted a minute apologizing for the space he took up. He came across the mezzanine with his hand extended while he was still 10 feet away. A habit so deeply embedded that it had stopped being a greeting and had become a kind of announcement. "Anderson," he said, gripping Michael's hand with both of his. "This place. Michael, this place. Philip." Michael shook the hand warm and direct. "How are you?" "Better now that I'm in a room that doesn't feel like a conference center with pretensions." Lancaster looked around with the appreciation of a man who had been in thousands of rooms and knew the difference between the ones that worked and the ones that merely cost money. "You know how rare it is to find a hotel that feels like someone actually lives here. That's the goal. The goal." Lancaster laughed. "That's what I love about you, Michael. You make it sound like basic competence." He looked across the room, and his expression changed into something more deliberate. "Listen, I want to introduce you to a few people tonight. I told Whitmore Daniel. Whitmore, you know him. I told him he needed to meet the man who built this group. There's something you two should be talking about." Michael kept his face easy. "Sure, Philip." Lancaster was already turning, already moving with the momentum of a man who operated at one speed. "Whitmore, Daniel." Across the room, Daniel Whitmore turned. He was holding a glass of wine and talking to two men Michael didn't recognize, and when Lancaster called his name, he turned with the polished responsiveness of a man who was always monitoring multiple conversations simultaneously. He saw Lancaster and smiled and moved toward them. He had not yet seen Michael's face. Then he did. The smile didn't fall away. It was more subtle than that it restructured itself the way a face restructured when the person wearing it received information that required recalculation. The warmth of the professional smile went from 60 watts to 40 in about a second and a half, and the eyes went from Lancaster to Michael and stayed there. "Daniel," Lancaster said, "this is Michael Anderson. He built this group from the ground up, 24 properties in 8 years, and this is the flagship. Finest hotel management operation in the Northeast, and I'll argue that in any room you want to put me in." Daniel Whitmore looked at Michael Anderson. He extended his hand. "We've met," Daniel said. Lancaster looked between them. "Oh, once," Michael said. He shook Daniel's hand. Firm, brief, perfectly calibrated. Briefly, Daniel's eyes stayed on him. "You were checking something," Daniel said. "At the front desk. I thought you worked here." "I do," Michael said. "A beat." "It's your hotel," Daniel said. Not a question. Processing out loud. "It is." Another beat. Lancaster looked delighted in the way of a man who enjoyed witnessing significant moments. "Small world, gentlemen." Daniel looked at Michael with the expression of a man doing extremely fast mental arithmetic, running through every interaction, every assumption, every moment of the past several months in which he'd been in this building, or talked about this building, or made a decision inside this building, and arriving at a total that clearly cost him something. "The suite modifications," Daniel said. "The night of the Whitmore dinner." "Standard policy," Michael said. "It applies to everyone." Daniel's jaw moved slightly. "You knew who I was." "I knew you were a guest," Michael said. "That's what mattered." Philip Lancaster was watching this exchange with the bright, interested eyes of a man who had lived long enough to recognize when he was watching something that had subtext he didn't have access to, and who was wise enough not to ask for it. "Michael," Lancaster said, "I'll let you two get acquainted. I want you at the table when we sit down, though. I've got something I want to talk to the both of you about. Business." He squeezed Michael's shoulder once and moved away into the room with the ease of a man who was comfortable everywhere. And then Michael and Daniel Whitmore were standing alone with 5 feet of expensive carpet between them. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "My wife knows you," Daniel said. "We were married," Michael said, "for 6 years." Daniel was quiet. "She didn't tell you," Michael said. "She told me she'd been married before." Daniel's voice was even controlled, the voice of a man who had built a career on not letting people see when something had hit him. "She didn't tell me who." "That was her call," Michael said, "not mine." Daniel looked at him with the particular intensity of a man trying to find the angle, the leverage, the agenda, the thing behind the thing. It was the way men like Daniel looked at everything Michael had learned. Not because they were malicious, but because they operated in a world where everything had an angle, and the absence of one was itself suspicious. "What do you want from this conversation?" Daniel said. "I'm hosting a dinner for Philip Lancaster," Michael said. "I want it to go well. That's it." "You're not going to—" Daniel stopped. "What?" Michael said. "Genuine." "I don't know. Make it difficult." He said it with a self-awareness that surprised Michael slightly, an acknowledgement that he was being paranoid that took a certain kind of honesty to make. "That's not who I am," Michael said. Daniel looked at him for another moment. Then something in the angle of his posture shifted, not softened exactly, but became less combat-ready. "She's been different," he said. "Lately. Claire." "So I hear," Michael said. "Quieter." Daniel looked at his glass, thinking about something. He looked back up at Michael. "She came back to this hotel. Did you know that 3 days after the gala? Said she had a meeting." "People have meetings here," Michael said. "She asked about the ownership at the concierge desk." Michael said nothing. Daniel looked at him with an expression that was complicated and human and more honest than anything Michael had expected from this man. "I'm not accusing you of anything," Daniel said. He stopped. "I need to know if there's something I need to know." Michael looked at Daniel Whitmore and felt genuine compassion for him, which was not what he had expected to feel, and which he didn't try to suppress because it was real, and he dealt in real things. She came here because she was trying to understand something about herself. Michael said carefully. Not about me. About herself. What does that mean? Ask her, Michael said. She'll tell you. Claire's not dishonest. She's working something out. Give her the space to work it out. Daniel looked at him for a long time. You still know her? I know who she was, Michael said. Whether that's still who she is, that's between you and her. Across the room, Claire was watching them. She'd been watching for 2 minutes, standing with a glass of wine she hadn't touched, watching the body language of the two men who represented the before and after of her adult life, standing in conversation with each other, and she could not read what was happening between them, which was itself significant because she could usually read everything. Then Michael looked up and found her eyes across the room. He held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he looked back at Daniel and said something that made Daniel nod once slowly. Claire didn't know what he'd said. She thought she might never know. But she watched Daniel turn and cross the room toward her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in a long time. Not the deal-closing confidence, not the performing power energy, but something quieter than both of those things. He stopped in front of her. You should have told me, he said. She held his gaze. I know. Why didn't you? She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated and would take more than a dinner party to get through. Because I wasn't ready to look at it, she said. I'm working on being ready. Daniel looked at her for a moment with the same calculating eyes. But underneath the calculation was something else. Something she recognized because she'd seen it before, years ago when he was still capable of showing it. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. Is this going to be a problem? He said. No, she said, and she meant it. But Daniel, I need us to talk, really talk. Not about the deal or the next meeting or the Q2 numbers. About us. He looked at her. Okay, he said, very quietly. Okay. Philip Lancaster's voice lifted above the room, calling people to take their seats. Michael Anderson was already moving toward the table, notebook tucked inside his jacket, unhurried. He sat down. He listened to Philip Lancaster tell the room what he wanted to talk about. He thought about Emma snorting water in a Brooklyn restaurant. He thought about the supply closet on the 32nd floor. He thought about nothing for a moment, just sat in the room he had built and listened to the sounds of it working the way it was supposed to work. Then he picked up his fork. And he had dinner. Philip Lancaster had a way of saying things that sounded casual until you were driving home afterward and suddenly understood what he'd actually meant. He'd done it at the dinner table that night, between the main course and dessert, in a voice that carried just far enough for the people immediately around him to hear, without being a formal announcement. He'd looked at Michael across the table and said, You know what I respect most about what you've built? You never needed anyone to know you were building it. The table had gone quiet in that particular way that happened when something landed harder than expected. Daniel Whitmore had been seated 4 chairs down. Michael had not looked at him when Lancaster said it. He didn't need to. He could feel the weight of Daniel's attention from where he sat, specific and sharp, the way you felt someone looking at you in a dark room. Lancaster had moved on immediately, the way Lancaster always moved on, pivoting to something about the Denver real estate market, with the effortless gear shift of a man who dropped depth charges casually and let other people dive for them. The conversation had resumed. Dinner had continued. But the table had not quite returned to what it was before Lancaster spoke. Michael had eaten his dessert. He had thanked Philip Lancaster at the door at 10:45 with genuine warmth, because Lancaster was a man worth genuine warmth, and they had stood in the corridor for a few minutes, talking about the Portland property, and whether the boutique hotel market in the Pacific Northwest was approaching saturation or just approaching its real potential. Michael said he thought the latter. Lancaster said he agreed, and that Michael should call him when Portland was ready because he had people who needed somewhere specific to stay. Then Lancaster had clapped him on the shoulder and gotten into the elevator and gone. Michael had turned back to the room. It was emptying the clean, unhurried dispersal of a dinner that had gone well. People gathering coats and exchanging last words with the ease of people who'd been well fed and well looked after. His events team was moving through the space with the invisible efficiency he'd spent 8 years training for, clearing, resetting, managing the transition from event to closure, without anyone feeling hurried. He'd spotted Ray near the entrance and given him a nod, good work. Ray had nodded back. I know. He was heading toward the corridor to take the service elevator down when Claire found him. She came around a corner quickly enough that they almost collided, and she stopped short, and for a half-second they were close enough that he could see the specific tension she was carrying in the set of her jaw and the way her eyes weren't quite settled. I need a minute, she said. He checked the time. 10:58. Okay. She glanced back over her shoulder. Not here. He gestured toward a small sitting area just off the corridor, 2 chairs and a low table, the kind of quiet pocket a well-designed hotel built into its event floors, for exactly this kind of moment when someone needed to be removed from the main current of things without going very far. They sat. Claire put her bag on the table and looked at her hands for a moment, and he let her because Claire always needed a moment to find the words she actually meant as opposed to the words she'd prepared. What did you say to him? She asked. To Daniel. Yes. I told him you were working something out, Michael said, and that he should give you space to work it out. She looked up. That's it. That's it. She studied him for a moment. He came back to me different. I know. Whatever you said, she paused. It wasn't what he expected. Most things about me aren't what people expect. She almost smiled at that. Almost. He wants to talk tonight, when we get home, a real conversation. She said it in a way that communicated both relief and the specific anxiety of a person who had been avoiding a real conversation long enough that having one had started to feel dangerous. I don't know if I'm ready for it. You've been ready for a while, Michael said. You're just scared of what you'll say. She looked at him sharply. Don't do that. Do what? Know me, she said. And then more quietly, it's been 8 years. Some things don't change that fast, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside through the corridor, the sounds of the evening winding down continued the murmur of departing guests, the low professional exchange of staff voices. The room had the quality of something suspended slightly outside the normal flow of time, the way certain conversations made rooms feel. Lancaster said something, Claire said. At the table. I know what he said. Did it bother you? Having someone say it out loud. He thought about it honestly. No. It would have bothered me once, a long time ago, when I still needed it to be seen. He looked at her. I stopped needing that somewhere around year 3. Year 3 of what? Of building, he said simply. At some point the work stopped being about proving something and started being just the work. What I do. Who I am. Claire absorbed this. Daniel needs it, she said. The recognition. The room knowing who he is. She wasn't saying it as a criticism, or not only as a criticism. It was more like an observation she'd been sitting with and finally saying out loud. He needs it the way some people need oxygen. Some people do, Michael said. It exhausts me, she said. She said it quietly, and it hit the air between them like something that had been held underwater for a long time and finally released. He didn't rush to fill the space after it. She looked at him. Is that terrible to say? It's honest. It feels like a betrayal. Of who? Of I don't know. Of the choice I made. She pressed her fingers against the edge of the table. I chose this, Michael. I chose Daniel and the life that came with it, and I had reasons, and they were real reasons. And I'm not saying I was wrong. I know you're not. I'm saying, she stopped, started again. I'm saying I'm tired in a way I don't know how to explain to him, and I'm afraid that if I try to explain it, he'll hear it as something it's not. Michael looked at her steadily. What are you afraid he'll hear? She met his eyes. That I want something else. And do you? A long silence. I want what I have, she said finally. Is that the same thing? It wasn't the same thing, and they both knew it, and he didn't pretend otherwise, because she'd asked him something real, and she deserved something real back. No, he said. But it's a better starting place than most people have. She looked at her bag. She looked at the table. She looked at the middle distance with the expression of a woman who was standing at the edge of something large, and assessing what it would cost her to step back from it versus what it would cost her to keep standing there. Then she said, "I owe Emma an apology." He hadn't expected that. "Emma, not for anything specific. She stopped. "She calls me sometimes when I'm in the middle of something and I'm not fully there. She knows it. She never says anything, but she knows." Her voice had changed the controlled professional register, giving way to something rawer. "She's 10 years old, and she already knows how to make herself smaller so she doesn't take up too much of the wrong person's time." Michael felt that land somewhere specific in his chest. "She doesn't do that with you," Claire said. "I've watched her. She takes up the exact right amount of space with you always. She never makes herself smaller." She looked at him. "How did you do that?" "I made sure she knew every single time that she was the most important thing in the room." "I do that too." "You do it when it's convenient," he said, not cruelly, just true. She flinched. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he said. "I'm telling you what you asked me." "I know." She breathed in. "I know you are." The corridor outside had gone quieter. Almost 11:30 now. The event floor was nearly empty. "I need to go," she said. But she didn't move. "I know." "This conversation," she started, "doesn't have to be anything," he said. "It's just a conversation between two people who used to know each other very well." She looked at him for a moment. "We still know each other." "In some ways. In the ways that matter," she said. And then she caught herself hearing how that sounded and looked away. He stood up. She stood up. They faced each other in the quiet of the sitting area, the two of them suspended for one moment in the accumulated weight of everything they'd been to each other and everything they'd become separately, and he thought about what he wanted to say and then said what was true. "Go home," he said. "Have the conversation with Daniel, the real one. You've been needing to have it for a while." "How do you know?" "Because you've been in this building 3 times in 2 weeks," he said. "And it wasn't about lunch meetings." She held his gaze. "Goodbye, Claire," he said. She picked up her bag. "Goodbye, Michael," she said. She walked back toward the main corridor. He watched her go. Then he went back to work. The next morning, a Thursday 7:40. Michael was in his office on the 14th floor of the building that housed Anderson Hospitality Group's headquarters, 6 blocks from the Grand Meridian, working through the Portland acquisition files with his general counsel, a precise and sardonic woman named Helen Park, who had been reading contracts since before Michael had started buying hotels, and who expressed her opinions about them in a vocabulary that was 70% legal terminology and 30% language that had no business being in a professional setting. "This indemnification clause," Helen said, sliding a page across the desk, "is the legal equivalent of someone handing you a nice glass of lemonade and then telling you after you've drunk it that they used your lemons." "Fix it," Michael said. "That's my plan." She made a note. "The closing timeline is still aggressive. I want a 4-day buffer built in." "You'll get 3. 3.5. Done." He moved to the next page. "What else?" "The Portland seller's attorney called me yesterday," Helen said, with the specific tone she used when something had happened that she was choosing to present calmly but did not find calm. "He wanted to know if it was true that our principal had some kind of personal connection to the Whitmore Group." Michael looked up. "Apparently," Helen continued, "Daniel Whitmore has been asking around about Anderson Hospitality in the past 48 hours to multiple people." She set down her pen. "Philip Lancaster called me this morning as a courtesy heads up. He says Whitmore reached out to him last night after the dinner." Michael was quiet for a moment. "What did Lancaster tell him?" "That Anderson Hospitality doesn't take outside investment and never has." Helen looked at him steadily. "Which Whitmore apparently already knew because he'd done enough research to know that, and Lancaster said that what Whitmore actually wanted to know wasn't investment access." She paused. "He wanted to know about you, personally." "What specifically?" "Your history, how you started, whether you'd always been—" She checked a note. "Lancaster's word, not mine. This substantial. Whether there was a period when you weren't." Michael sat back in his chair. He thought about Daniel Whitmore at the dinner table running calculations. He thought about what a man like Daniel would do with the recognition that he'd underestimated someone. He thought about Claire in the sitting room saying, "I want to want what I have." "What did Lancaster tell him?" Michael said. "That you started with one broken-down property in Trenton, New Jersey, and that what you did with it was the most impressive operational turnaround he'd seen in 40 years in commercial real estate." Helen picked her pen back up. "He also told him that you were someone who couldn't be bought, which Lancaster meant as the highest possible compliment." "And Whitmore's reaction?" "Lancaster said he went very quiet." Helen paused. "Which Lancaster read as respect." "I'm reading it as something else." "What?" "Recalibration," she said. "Men like Whitmore don't stay surprised for long. They absorb the information, and they find a way to use it." Michael looked at the files on his desk. "He's going to come to me. That's my read. With a proposal. Investment partnership advisory role, one of the three. Probably investment because it would let him put his name adjacent to yours without having to acknowledge that you got there first." She said it without judgment, just the flat, clear assessment of someone who had read 1,000 contracts and understood that the terms people proposed revealed more about their character than anything they said out loud. "How do you want to handle it?" Michael thought for a moment. He thought about the conversation in the sitting room. He thought about what he'd said to Daniel directly, "That's not who I am." He thought about the particular specific thing that a man with something to prove wanted most from a man who had nothing left to prove. "Let him come," Michael said. "We'll hear what he says, and we'll decide from what he says." Helen wrote something. "And if the proposal is actually reasonable, then I'll give it serious consideration. And if it's a positioning move wrapped in financial language, then I'll decline it politely, and he'll spend 6 months being annoyed about it." He paused. "And that'll be that." Helen nodded once briskly, the way she nodded when the meeting had produced what meetings were supposed to produce. Portland files. Back to the indemnification. They went back to the indemnification. 3 days later, Daniel Whitmore called Michael's office directly. Not through an intermediary. Not through his own assistant calling Michael's assistant. Directly on the main office line at 9:15 on a Monday morning, which Michael took as a deliberate signal. The call was not a casual inquiry, but it was also not a formal approach. It was something in between. Personal enough to be significant. Structured enough to be professional. Michael's assistant put it through. "Anderson," Michael said. "It's Daniel Whitmore." A pause. "I hope this isn't a bad time. What can I do for you?" Another pause, and Michael could hear Daniel choosing his approach the way you heard gears shift in a careful driver. "I've done some research on your group over the past week." "I'm aware," Michael said. A beat. "Lancaster told you." "Helen Park told me." Lancaster told Helen. Right. Daniel absorbed this. "I want to have a conversation, not about investment. I know you don't take outside money. Something else." "What else?" "My group is considering a shift into managed hospitality assets," Daniel said. "We have capital in commercial real estate that's underperforming and the hospitality rehabilitation model. What you've built is the most efficient conversion of distressed assets I've seen in this market." He paused. "I'd like to learn from it, not acquire it. Learn from it." Michael was quiet for a moment. He was aware this was not what he'd expected. He'd expected the positioning move. He'd expected the offer dressed up in partnership language. What Daniel was describing was something more direct than that, more honest in its way, which was itself surprising. "Why come to me directly?" Michael said. "You could hire consultants, buy reports." "Reports don't tell me what you know," Daniel said. "I'm not interested in the publicly available version. I'm interested in how you actually think about a distressed property. The operational logic." He paused. "I'm also," and here his voice shifted just slightly, just enough to notice, "I'm being straightforward with you because anything else would be insulting given everything." Given everything. Michael sat with that for a moment. "You talked to Claire," Michael said. "I did." A long pause. "We had the conversation she needed to have. I won't go into the details of that." His voice was controlled, but not empty. There was something under it. The sound of a man who had been shown something about himself and was still in the early stages of deciding what to do with what he'd seen. But part of that conversation involved an honest accounting of what I knew and didn't know about her past, and about you. I see. I owe you something, Daniel said. You don't. I treated you with contempt the first time I was in your building, Daniel said, flat and direct. I didn't know who you were. That's not an excuse. I'm just... He stopped. I'm acknowledging it. Michael thought about the reception desk, the 14-minute checkout time at the Marriott in New Jersey, the general manager taking credit at the quarterly review. He thought about every room where he'd been the wrong person's idea of important. It's acknowledged, Michael said. And it's done. That's it. That's it, Michael said. What else would I do with it? A pause on Daniel's end. Most people would do something with it. I'm not most people, Michael said. You know that by now. He could hear Daniel almost exhale. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. I'm learning that. He waited a beat. So, the conversation. Is that something you'd consider? Michael thought about Helen Park and her 3 categories investment partnership advisory. He thought about what Daniel was actually asking, which was none of those 3 things. What Daniel was asking was, can I sit across a table from you as an equal and learn something without it being a transaction? That was a different question, and it had a different answer. Buy me coffee, Michael said. 1 hour. Bring specific questions. When? Friday morning, 9 o'clock. There's a place 2 blocks from my office. My assistant will send the address. I'll be there, Daniel said. They hung up. Michael set the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet of his office, looking at nothing in particular. He thought about what Philip Lancaster had said at the dinner table. You never needed anyone to know you were building it. He thought about Emma on the kitchen floor in Jersey City, looking at the spreadsheet with 3 hotels on it and saying, they're all going up. He thought about a hotel in Trenton, New Jersey, that smelled like a compromise that had given up on itself, and an old man named Gerald, who said his father had shaken hands with everyone who came through the front door for the first 20 years, and the specific quiet satisfaction of watching that building become something worth walking into. I thought about all of this, and then he picked up the phone and called Emma. She answered on the 3rd ring, which meant she was probably reading. Hey, Dad? Hey, you busy? Kind of, but not in a way that matters. The sound of a book being set down. What's up? Nothing, he said. I just wanted to hear your voice. A pause. Are you okay? I'm good, he said. Really good. He stopped, found the honest version of what he wanted to say. I was thinking about that night in the old apartment, when you were 6. We talked about hotels. She was quiet for a moment. The pasta night. The pasta night. I remember. Her voice had the particular quality it got when she was being serious, the same quality it had always had since she was 4 years old, and asking questions that were too large for the room. You said you wanted to make hotels that care. Yeah. Did you? She asked. He thought about Dolores on the 32nd floor, and the supply closet, and the note in the notebook with her name underlined. He thought about Gerald, and the 1959 opening and the handshake policy. He thought about a TripAdvisor rating climbing from 2.3 to 4.4. I think so, he said. I'm still working on it. That's the right answer, Emma said. You should always still be working on it. He smiled at the phone. When did you get so smart? I've always been this smart, she said. You just keep acting surprised. He laughed, actually laughed the clean, unguarded kind that happened around Emma and almost nobody else. Okay, go back to your book. Already am, she said. Love you, Dad. Love you too, Em. He set the phone down. The office was quiet. Outside through the window, he never thought to look through. When he was working, the city was doing what the city always did. Moving, producing, demanding, indifferent in the beautiful, bracing way that cities were indifferent, leaving every person in it entirely responsible for the meaning they made out of the noise. He opened the notebook. He turned to a fresh page. He wrote Friday, 9 o'clock. Specific questions. He underlined specific. Then he wrote one more thing below it and looked at it for a moment. The bones of the building are solid. What's inside is the work. He'd written that in the Trenton property the first week he'd owned it, standing in the lobby that smelled like a compromise that had given up on itself, trying to explain to himself why he was there and what he intended to do. He'd written it about a broken-down hotel in New Jersey. But it had always been about more than the hotel. He closed the notebook. I went back to work, because that was the thing nobody ever wrote profiles about, and nobody ever made speeches about at industry dinners, and nobody ever thought to put in the press releases that his publicist didn't exist to write the work, didn't stop. The work was not a chapter you got through and then arrived at the good part. The work was the good part. The satisfaction was not in having built something. The satisfaction was in the building, in the daily, unglamorous, deeply specific act of walking into a room that was broken and making it function, and then walking into another one and another one after that. Philip Lancaster had said he'd never needed anyone to know he was building it. That was true. What was also true, what was perhaps even more true, was that he had never needed to finish. The not finishing was the point. You kept walking the building. You kept crouching down and touching the baseboards. You kept writing the name of the housekeeper in the notebook and underlining it so you wouldn't forget. That was it. That was the whole thing. The coffee shop 2 blocks from Michael's office was not impressive. That was in fact why he'd chosen it. It had 12 tables, a counter that had been wiped down 10,000 times until the surface had a specific earned smoothness, and coffee that was genuinely good without announcing itself about it. The owner was a Vietnamese immigrant named Than, who had opened the place 11 years ago and had never once considered expanding, because what he had was exactly what he'd wanted, and he understood in the bone-deep way of a man who had built something real. That expansion for its own sake was a different thing entirely from excellence. Michael had been coming here for 3 years. Than knew his order. Than also knew, without ever being told explicitly, that when Michael came in with someone, the table by the back window was to be quietly kept available, and that refills happened without being requested, and that the conversation at that table was nobody else's business. Daniel Whitmore walked in at 9:02 on Friday morning, 2 minutes late, which Michael noted not as a power move or a slight, but simply as information. Daniel was the kind of man who was chronically almost on time, who operated at a pace that made punctuality feel like a constraint rather than a courtesy. Michael had been here since 8:55. Daniel looked around, found him, and crossed the room with the directness of a man who had decided on something and was carrying it through before he could reconsider. He sat down. He looked at the coffee already on the table, and then at Michael. "You were early," Daniel said. "I'm always early," Michael said. "I know that now." Daniel took off his coat, folded it over the back of the chair with the neat automatic precision of a man who had spent his whole adult life in rooms where presentation mattered. Then he looked at Michael directly. "Thank you for agreeing to this. You said you'd have specific questions." "I do." He reached inside his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, set it on the table, did not unfold it. "Before I get to those, I want to say something first. And I'd like to say it without you deflecting it, because I think you have a habit of deflecting things that are aimed at you personally." Michael looked at him. "Say it." "What you've built is extraordinary," Daniel said. "I don't mean the valuation. I don't mean the portfolio size or the occupancy rates or the operational margins, though all of those are extraordinary too. I mean—" He paused, searching for the precise language, and Michael could see him working to say something he meant, rather than something that sounded right. "The way people talk about working for you. I've spent a week talking to people in your industry. Not your competitors. Your people. Former staff, current staff, people who left your properties and went somewhere else and would come back tomorrow if they could." He stopped. "That's the extraordinary part." Michael said nothing. "I spent 20 years believing that loyalty was something you bought," Daniel said, "or something you enforced. I built a company on that belief. And sitting in your hotel last week, watching the way your staff moved through that room, the way that woman at the front desk held her ground with me when I was being a very difficult person to deal with, I realized I've never built that. Not once. I've built compliance. I've built performance. He looked at Michael. I've never built loyalty. It was, Michael thought, one of the most honest things he had ever heard Daniel Whitmore say. Maybe one of the most honest things Daniel Whitmore had ever said to anyone. What changed? Michael asked. Daniel looked at the folded piece of paper on the table. Claire. He said it simply. The conversation we had. She said something that I've been sitting with all week. He was quiet for a moment. She said that the most exhausting thing about our life was that nothing in it felt like it was built for us. It was all built for other people to look at. Michael was careful with his face. She wasn't ending the marriage, Daniel said quickly, reading the stillness. I want you to know that. She was trying to explain something. About what she needed. About what we'd never had. He looked down at the table. And I realized, sitting there listening to her, that she was right. That I had spent a decade building a life that was optimized for external validation, and I had never once asked either of us if that was the life we wanted. What did you tell her? Michael asked. That I didn't know how to build anything else. He said it without self-pity, just the flat, clear acknowledgement of a man who had located a structural flaw in his own foundation and was staring at it directly. And that I wanted to learn. The coffee shop moved around them. The soft percussion of cups on saucers, the low murmur of other people's mornings. Than's voice from behind the counter dealing with someone's complicated order with patient brevity. The ordinary music of a room where someone had thought carefully about what people needed. Unfold the paper, Michael said. Daniel unfolded it. There were 7 questions. Handwritten, numbered. Michael looked at them without picking up the paper. They were good questions, specific, operational. The kind of questions that took real thought to formulate, that demonstrated actual homework. Not general curiosity, real engagement. You wrote these yourself, Michael said. Yes. Not your assistant? No. Michael picked up his coffee. Then let's go through them. They went through them. It took 40 minutes, and somewhere in the middle of the 3rd question, Michael stopped thinking of it as a favor or a courtesy and started thinking of it as a conversation, which was a different thing. Daniel asked well and listened better than Michael had expected, not with the half attention of someone waiting for their turn to talk, but with the real present quality of someone who was genuinely trying to rearrange their understanding of something. At the 5th question, about how Michael identified which distressed properties were worth taking on and which ones were fundamentally broken, beyond operational repair. Daniel said something that stopped Michael mid-sentence. Is it always the people? Daniel asked. When you walk a building, is it always the staff that tells you whether it's worth saving? Michael looked at him. Yes, he said. Almost always. A building can have infrastructure problems, deferred maintenance, outdated systems. All of that is fixable if you have the capital and the will. But if a building has been run in a way that's broken the people inside it, if the staff have learned to be invisible, to keep their heads down, to care as little as possible, because caring costs them, and nobody rewards the cost that takes much longer to fix. Sometimes it can't be fixed. You have to clear it out and rebuild from zero. Daniel was quiet for a moment. How do you fix it when it can be fixed? You show them that someone's paying attention, Michael said. Not surveilling them, paying attention. There's a difference. You ask questions and you mean them. You write down what they tell you, and you come back 2 weeks later, and you've done something about it. He paused. Dolores on the 32nd floor told me the supply closet had been wrong for 4 years. 4 years. Nobody had asked. I asked and I wrote it down, and 3 days later someone came to look at the closet. That woman will remember that for the rest of the time she works in that building. Not because I did something huge. Because I showed her that what she said mattered. Daniel looked at the table. Michael could see him doing the thing he'd been doing since the dinner, holding what he heard against what he knew about himself, and measuring the distance between them. How long did it take you to learn that? Daniel asked. I didn't learn it, Michael said. I think I was always built that way. The divorce just... He paused. It cleared the space for me to use it. Daniel nodded slowly. She made you better, he said. By leaving. She made space for me to make myself better, Michael said. That's a different thing. Daniel looked at him. You're very precise. About some things. About the things that matter to you. Daniel folded the piece of paper and put it back in his jacket. I have to ask you something that's not on the list. Okay. Do you think I can change? Daniel said. Not the business model. Me. The actual. He moved his hand, once a gesture that encompassed something too large for a specific word, the way I'm built. Michael looked at the man across the table from him. This sharp, anxious, status-driven, genuinely intelligent man who had walked into a coffee shop 2 minutes late and spent 40 minutes asking better questions than Michael had anticipated, and who was now sitting with his hands flat on the table, asking something that cost him something real to ask. I think you just proved you can, Michael said. The question you just asked me, that's not a question a man asks if he's not already changing. Daniel absorbed that. Then he said quietly, she loved you, you know. She never stopped, not completely. Michael held himself completely still. I'm not saying it to hurt you, Daniel said quickly. Or to, I don't even know why I'm saying it. I just... He stopped. I found out a lot of things in that conversation. Things she'd never said out loud before. And one of them was that she had spent years believing she made the wrong choice, and then convincing herself she hadn't. And then the gala happened, and you were standing in your lobby, and she stopped being able to convince herself. Michael said nothing. She's not leaving me, Daniel said. I want to be clear. We're not... He stopped again. She wants to make it work. She's committed to making it work. But she needed me to know the truth about what she'd been carrying. And I needed to hear it, even though it was... He breathed in, difficult. You're telling me this because you think I deserve to know, Michael said. I'm telling you because she asked me to, Daniel said. She said you'd been honest with her multiple times at cost to yourself, and that she owed you the same. Michael looked at his coffee. I thought about the kitchen table in Hoboken, and a 4-year-old with pasta. He thought about the cold coffee on the desk, the morning after the divorce papers. He thought about 8 years of walking buildings and writing in notebooks and getting on the floor to check baseboards and coming home to an apartment that was quiet in the specific way of a place where a child wasn't anymore, and making himself get up the next morning and do it again. He thought about all of it, and he found that what he felt sitting with it was not grief and not triumph and not vindication. What he felt was something quieter than all of those things, something that felt more than anything else, like the understanding that the story had been the right story, that the path through the divorce and the Hoboken apartment and the Trenton Hotel and the 24 properties and the Lancaster dinner and this coffee shop on a Friday morning had been in the most important sense exactly the path it needed to be. Tell her thank you, Michael said. I will, Daniel said. They sat for a moment in the quiet of that. Then Michael said, your 6th question. You didn't let me finish the answer. Daniel almost smiled. He reached back into his jacket for the piece of paper. They went back to the questions. 3 weeks after the coffee shop, Emma turned 11. Michael had been planning her birthday for 6 weeks, not a party, because Emma had opinions about parties that centered mainly on finding them exhausting, but a day. A specific constructed day that moved through the things she cared about in the order that made sense to her. The Natural History Museum in the morning lunch at the ramen place in the East Village that she'd been requesting since the Brooklyn restaurant incident. And then the afternoon at the Jersey City apartment, doing nothing in particular, which was Emma's preferred activity, and which Michael had learned to receive as a gift rather than a lack of ambition. She arrived at 8:30 on a Saturday morning with her overnight bag and the book she was currently reading, and the particular energy she had on days that she was allowing herself to look forward to. Happy birthday, he said at the door. Thanks. She walked in, dropped her bag, looked at the kitchen. Did you make breakfast? Scrambled eggs with cheese. The right ones. The right ones. She sat at the kitchen table with the ease of someone who belonged completely in a space. He set the plate down. She picked up her fork. They didn't talk for a moment, not because there was nothing to say, but because they had long since established that silence between them was never uncomfortable, just another way of being together. Then Emma said without looking up from her eggs, Mom told me. Michael paused. Told you what? He said careful. About seeing you at the hotel, the gala thing. She ate a bite. And the dinner after. And that she and Daniel had a big conversation. She finally looked up. She didn't tell me the details. She just said that she'd had to be honest about some things that were hard to be honest about, and that you had been... She paused, apparently quoting accurately, genuinely decent about it, which I should have expected because Michael is always genuinely decent. Michael sat down across from her. How do you feel about that? He asked. Emma thought about it with the seriousness she brought to questions that deserved seriousness. I feel like it's good that she talked to Daniel. She's been... She paused, and he recognized the word she was choosing, quieter lately, thinking about something. And now she seems less like she's carrying it. Good, he said. She also said something else. Emma looked at him directly. She said she was sorry for things she said a long time ago, about you not being ambitious. She put her fork down. She said she was wrong, and she wanted me to know she knew she was wrong, even if she couldn't say it to you directly. Michael looked at his daughter, his 11-year-old daughter, who had his steadiness and her mother's intelligence, and something in the combination that was entirely her own, sitting at a kitchen table in Jersey City, with scrambled eggs and a birthday morning ahead of her delivering a message that had taken 8 years to arrive. What did you tell her? He asked. I told her that you'd never said anything bad about her, Emma said. Not once, in my whole life. She looked at him. And that I thought that was one of the best things about you. He held that for a moment. And then I told her that the eggs were better at your place anyway, Emma said. He laughed, the clean, unguarded kind. She picked her fork back up. Don't make it weird, Dad. I'm not making it weird. You have the face. What face? The one you make when something matters more than you want to show. She ate another bite. I've known that face since I was like 4. He looked at his daughter and felt with a completeness he almost couldn't hold how much of his life was sitting across this kitchen table from him on a Saturday morning eating eggs with cheese. Em, he said. Yeah. I want to show you something today, after the museum. She looked up. What kind of something? The Portland Hotel. It just reopened. I drove up yesterday to walk it. I want you to see it. She considered this. We're going to Portland for my birthday. We're going to Portland for 20 minutes and then coming back for the ramen. That's a very weird birthday. You're a very specific person. She thought about it. Then she nodded once with the decisive quality she'd always had. Okay, but I'm picking the music in the car. You always pick the music in the car, because you have terrible taste in music. I have excellent taste in music. Dad. She looked at him with the patient, affectionate exasperation that had replaced the childhood wonder somewhere around age 8. You listened to the same 3 albums the entire year I was in 4th grade. They're good albums. They're fine albums. There's a difference. She finished her eggs. Can we go soon? The museum opens at 9. They went. The museum was everything it always was. Emma moving through it with the focused private engagement of someone who was not performing interest but genuinely feeling it, pausing at the things that caught her and walking past the things that didn't, without any apparent concern for what she was supposed to find fascinating. Michael walked beside her and answered questions when she had them and stayed quiet when she didn't. And somewhere around the geology exhibit, she took his hand briefly and then let it go. The way she occasionally did not, because she needed to, but because she wanted to, and she was 11 now, and starting to become aware of which gestures still felt natural, and which ones she was growing past. He noticed. He filed it in the same place he filed everything that mattered. The permanent record. They drove to Portland after the ramen with Emma's music filling the car. Something he genuinely didn't recognize, but that had a specific, interesting energy he found himself responding to without wanting to admit it. He parked outside the Portland property at 3:20 in the afternoon. It was a 90-room hotel in a converted warehouse building in the Pearl District. Anderson Hospitality's 24th property. The acquisition that had taken 14 months and $40,000 in legal fees and a contractor who'd underestimated the plumbing retrofit and a reopening event that had been rescheduled twice. It looked from the outside like a building that knew what it was. Emma got out of the car and looked at it. "This one's different," she said. "What makes you say that?" She thought about it. "It looks like it was something before." She looked at the facade, the bones of the warehouse visible in the brick, and the scale of the windows, the hotel that had grown inside it rather than replacing it. Like it didn't forget what it was. He looked at her. She was 11 years old. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly right." They went inside. The lobby was warm and specific in the way that Portland lobbies needed to be rooted in the texture of the city around it, not imported from a template. Local art on the walls. Staff who moved with the ease of people who'd been treated as professionals and had responded by becoming them. The front desk attendant looked up when they walked in and said good afternoon in a way that landed like it was meant, not performed. Emma walked slowly, looking at everything with the same museum attention she'd given the geology exhibit. "The flowers are right," she said. "The flowers, they're not trying to impress anyone," she said. "They're just there because someone thought someone would like them." He stood next to her and looked at the flowers. She was right. The property manager, a 32-year-old named Cassandra, who had transferred from the Denver property and was 6 weeks into the Portland role, appeared from a corridor and spotted Michael, and came over with the professional warmth he recognized from people who actually liked their jobs. "Mr. Anderson, we weren't expecting you." "I was in the area," he said, which was only true if Portland counted as being in the area of New Jersey, which it didn't. "How's the first week going?" "Really well," Cassandra said, and he could hear the specific register of someone reporting genuinely rather than performing positivity. "We had a hiccup Tuesday with the breakfast service timing, but the team identified it themselves before I did and had a solution on my desk by noon, which—" She paused, allowing herself a small pride. "I think that's the thing you've been building for right staff who don't wait to be told there's a problem." "That's exactly the thing," he said. Cassandra looked at Emma. "Is this your daughter?" "This is Emma," Michael said. "Happy birthday," Cassandra said, because Ray had evidently mentioned it, because information in Anderson hospitality moved the way information moved in buildings where people actually talk to each other. "Can I get you anything? We have a pastry chef who just started yesterday, and she's been looking for people to test things on." Emma looked at Michael. "Obviously, yes," he said. They sat in the lobby with pastries that were genuinely excellent. Cassandra's new hire had an instinct for flavor that didn't require explanation. And Emma ate and looked at the room and asked Cassandra questions that were so specific and so good that Cassandra answered them with the full attention she reserved for people who deserved it, which was most people, but especially this one. "Do the people who stay here know that someone thought about them?" Emma asked. Cassandra looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Before they got here," Emma said. "Did someone think about what they'd need? Or do they only think about it after there's a problem?" Cassandra was quiet for a moment. She looked at Michael. "That's actually a really good question. And I think the honest answer is both. We've done a lot of thinking in advance, and we're still learning what we missed." "That's the right answer," Emma said, nodding. She sounded. Michael thought very much like her father. They drove back toward the city in the late afternoon. Emma had fallen asleep somewhere after Salem, which was what long car rides and birthday pastries in combination produced. He drove with the music off and the city coming up on the horizon ahead of him, the particular late daylight making everything look like it meant something, which he supposed it did. His phone buzzed on the console. He glanced at it at a red light. "A text from Ray Dolores asked me to tell you the closet is perfect." Her word. Perfect. He read it twice. He set the phone down. The light changed. He drove. In the seat beside him, Emma slept with the total unbothered completeness of someone who had had a good day and knew it, and he drove her home through the early evening toward an apartment in Jersey City that had started as the smallest possible thing. 2 bedrooms, one for him, one for her, on the week she came, and had expanded over 8 years in the way that honest spaces expanded, not through renovation or addition, but through being lived in fully, through being the place where the real things happened. He thought about Philip Lancaster at the dinner table. You never needed anyone to know you were building it. He thought about Dolores on the 32nd floor. Nobody asked. He thought about Gerald in Trenton. My father shook hands with everyone who came through the front door for the first 20 years. He thought about Emma at 6. Did you make the eggs? He thought about Claire at 34 across a conference table. I need someone who wants to build something. He thought about Daniel at the coffee shop with a folded piece of paper and 7 handwritten questions. Do you think I can change? I thought about all of it the whole 8 years. The whole long, improbable accumulation of mornings and notebooks and baseboards and negotiation rooms and pastries in Portland and cold coffee in Hoboken. And he understood in the quiet of the car, with his daughter sleeping beside him, and the city coming up ahead, what the whole thing had actually been. It had been a lesson, not the kind you received from someone else. The kind you gave yourself by refusing to stop, by walking the building one more time, and then one more time after that, and writing down what you found, and coming back 2 weeks later to check. The lesson was, this dignity was not something that other people gave you, and it was not something that success gave you, and it was not something that the recognition of the Philip Lancasters, or the apologies of the Claire Andersons, or the questions of the Daniel Whitmores gave you. Dignity was what was left when you had done the honest work, and you knew it in the private and permanent and completely inalienable part of yourself that no one had access to except you. Claire had thought he wasn't building anything. She had been measuring the wrong thing. He had been building the whole time. He had been building himself. Emma stirred in the seat beside him, opened her eyes halfway, looked at the city coming up on the horizon with the sleepy, unsurprised recognition of someone returning to a place that was theirs. Almost home, she said. Almost home, he said. She closed her eyes again. He drove, and the city opened up in front of him, all of it, the whole enormous, indifferent, beautiful machine of it, and somewhere in those lights and